Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Brief. As China-Australia relations are warming up, Australian Prime Minister Albanese is making his second visit to China in 2 years. In contrast, the United States and Australia have found themselves at odds because of the tariffs imposed by Trump. Since Trump returned to the White House, Albanese has not visited the United States. Earlier, at the G7 summit, Trump left Canada early due to handling the Israel-Iran conflict, which led to the cancellation of the US-Australia summit. This shows just how distant the current US-Australia relationship is. On the 12th, Australian Prime Minister Albanese set off for a visit to China, which will be his second visit since taking office in 2022. Foreign media reports have especially highlighted the state of the US-Australia alliance. Against this backdrop, the diplomatic community is paying close attention to whether the US will respond negatively if Australia further deepens its relationship with China. China is Australia's largest bilateral trading partner, accounting for about 1/3 of Australia's export value. According to data from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the total value of China-Australia trade in 2024 is close to $312 billion Australian dollars. Australian media have noted that between 2020 and 2024, China imposed restrictions on some Australian exporters. Afterwards, relations between the two countries seem to be warming up. Christoph Nedopil, director of the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University in Australia, said that there is indeed a shared interest in strengthening China-Australia relations, but this is not something that has only just begun, it is the result of years of effort. He does not believe that China is trying to take advantage of tensions between the US and Australia for its own gain. He pointed out that, in fact, even before Trump took office, China was already promoting both bilateral and multilateral cooperation. At the press conference on July 8, a reporter asked Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers whether the Australian government is considering further promoting free trade with China, South Korea, and Japan in response to the new round of tariff policies proposed by Trump. Previously, Trump announced that if Japan and South Korea fail to reach an agreement with the US, starting in August, their goods will be subject to at least a 25% tariff. Although Chalmers did not directly respond to the issue of US tariffs, he emphasized that stable China-Australia relations have a positive impact on economic growth, employment, and industrial development. He said that establishing a good, stable, and reliable trade relationship with China is key to ensuring the continued healthy growth of the Australian economy. Australia hopes to build good, reliable, and diversified trade relationships globally. Australia has high-quality export markets and also has huge market opportunities. Andrew Davies, Senior Policy Advisor at the National Security College of the Australian National University, pointed out that although relations between Australia and China are improving, the relationship between Australia and the United States is a bit tense. Davies believes that this tension largely stems from the tariff policies announced by Trump in April, as well as the tough approach the US government takes in handling foreign relations. However, he also pointed out that although the relationship is facing challenges at the moment, diplomacy itself is an ongoing and constantly evolving process. So far, the US has not raised tariffs on Australia, and most Australian exports face a baseline tariff rate of 10%, while steel and aluminum products are subject to a 50% tariff. Andrews said that a 10% tariff is probably the best-case scenario, since, after all, no other country has managed to secure a tariff exemption through negotiations. Although the chances of lowering tariffs or obtaining exemptions are slim, there are still concerns that some private discussions are questioning whether this could trigger retaliatory tariff actions from the US. Media outlets like The Australian have previously reported that Albanese has recently been frequently criticized for being too close to China without any real basis, especially since, at the G7 summit, he was unable to have a face-to-face meeting with US President Trump. After that, news of his planned visit to China quickly became a hot topic. On July 1, Albanese refuted claims on a program that he was putting China-Australia relations above US-Australia relations. When the host deliberately tried to stir things up by pressing him on why he had met with Chinese leaders more often than with Trump, Albanese showed clear dissatisfaction. The director of the Griffith University Asia Institute in Australia, Nedopil, believes that the Trump administration's policies are often unpredictable. In a sense, current US decision-making seems to be news-driven and strongly influenced by short-term emotions, so Trump might feel disrespected by certain actions. He might then make a spur-of-the-moment negative decision. When talking about US-China competition, Nedopil said that the rivalry between the two sides is intensifying on multiple fronts. He believes that, to some extent, this has weakened America's dominant position, which is also a factor Trump has to consider. He said, "I think another thing that's happening is that, in reality, many Asian countries and emerging economies no longer view China as negatively as they did in the past. This change makes the US appear so powerful, and even makes the US itself feel this way. That's why it's trying all sorts of methods to maintain its influence." To sum it up simply, China and Australia have always had a highly complementary economic and trade relationship. It's just that some Australian politicians bought into the American narrative and insisted on confronting China for several years, which basically got them nowhere. Exports of beef, wine, and other goods to China dropped sharply, actually benefiting their big brother, the American farmers and wine producers. Secondly, there's the Trump tariff conflict. Traditional allies like Australia's Albanese, these politicians actually woke up pretty quickly. Third, emerging economies were already developing a more favorable view of China. Trump's indiscriminate tariff war was the starting point of the decline of American hegemony, and the result was that the US no longer looked so powerful, and honestly, seemed pretty outdated. Australian Prime Minister Albanese chose to prioritize doing business with China first. After he took office, he clearly toned down the confrontational stance towards China. As long as the US wasn't putting on too much pressure, he'd just step aside a bit. For example, unlike the past few years, he himself didn't attend various summits, only sending a deputy to represent him. Moves like this obviously show that he has no intention of following NATO's lead in confronting China head-on. And as for those allies who continue to follow America's lead, things aren't much better for them either. They're still being hit with tariffs, which only makes them feel even more disgruntled. President Trump announced a new round of tariffs targeting 8 countries, and among them, the so-called reciprocal tariff rate on Philippine products has been raised to 20%. This is slightly higher than the 17% first announced on April 2nd, and it will take effect starting August 1st. Trump posted a letter from Philippine President Marcos Jr. on his own social media platform. The letter went like this. It said, "Goods that are rerouted to avoid higher tariffs will be subject to even higher tariffs. Please understand that this 20% figure is still far below the level needed to eliminate the trade deficit between us and you." Previously, at the end of Trump's first presidential term and during the Biden administration, the director of Southeast Asia and ASEAN Affairs at the White House National Security Council, who is now at the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, Henrietta Levin, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies China Research Center, declined to comment on the Philippines, but she told Nikkei Asia with some frustration that, considering the Philippines is an important treaty ally of the United States, any move by Manila to reduce its trust in the US could have even broader strategic implications. One scenario is particularly worrying. After that, Levin started to play the China card, criticizing Trump's approach and saying that, in order for the US to effectively compete with China in Southeast Asia, that means proving itself to be a reliable, predictable, and trustworthy long-term partner. Unfortunately, the message sent by these tariff policies is exactly the opposite. Philippine President Marcos Jr. has not responded to Trump's tariff decision. Philippine Secretary of Economic Affairs Frederick Ng said that the Philippines is concerned about the U.S. decision to impose a 20% tariff on their exports, but he stated that they will continue to push forward with bilateral negotiations in hopes of reaching a free trade agreement, or at least other comprehensive economic agreements. Back in May, the Philippines was still planning to lower tariff rates by increasing purchases of American products. However, Trump now seems uninterested in negotiating with these smaller countries anymore. Instead, he just slapped on a 20% tariff. Not only did he not reduce it, but it's actually a bit higher than the 17% announced on April 2nd. In conclusion, after years of being the anti-China vanguard for the US, Marcos Jr. still has to endure a 20% tariff. What's even more helpless is that the Philippines actually has to thank the US, because among America's allies, their tariff increase is considered one of the lowest. It seems that the primary requirement for being a US ally is to set aside your dignity and willingly submit.